Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Configuring and Backing Up Virtual Machines with Veeam Backup. In this lesson, we'll start off by showing you how to connect your Veeam Backup console to your vSphere virtual infrastructure. Specifically, we'll point Veeam Backup to the vCenter server so that it can learn about your virtual infrastructure. I'll show you how to configure email notifications so that you'll get an email when a backup job fails or succeeds. We'll cover what you need to know about user roles in Veeam Backup so that you can delegate out administration to specific Windows groups. From there, I'll show you how to create and run a backup job in Veeam Backup, and in the real world, what you need to include or exclude from that backup job. We'll review the output of the backup job, and I can tell you, just like in the real world, we're not going to get 100% success the first time. So what we'll need to do is to readjust that backup job and then create a new backup job using a different transport protocol, specifically the Network Block Device Protocol. And then I'll finish up the video with the 10 things that you must know about backup jobs in Veeam Backup. And with that, let's get started. Here I have the vSphere virtual infrastructure for the Wired Brain Coffee Company. This is the virtual infrastructure that we'll be backing up with Veeam Backup and Replication. I've got a number of different types of virtual machines, both Windows and Linux. I've also got virtual machines that are running and virtual machines that are powered off. I've got 2 different ESX hosts and I've got 3 data stores. And what we're going to do is to back up this virtual infrastructure with Veeam Backup. So let's go over to the Veeam Backup console. So this is the Veeam Backup console that we installed in the previous video. And when it first comes up, it prompts you here, number 1, to add a server. And that server could be either an ESX server or a virtual center server. And then secondly, to create a job, and then to run that job. So the first thing that we need to do is to add a new server. So I'm just going to click Add Server here. And it brings up this Add Server wizard. And you can see that we can add either a virtual center server, an ESX or ESXi host, or a Linux server. So in our case at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, we have vcenter.wiredbraincoffee.com, and that's the name of our virtual center server. So we'll click Next here and add that, and we need to enter the administrator credentials for the vCenter server in domain/username format. So we'll do wiredbraincoffee/administrator. And I'll type in the password. I'll say next here. And it says you've successfully added the new server to the management tree. I'll check here to connect when I finish and click finish. Alright, and there you go. You notice over here on the left, here's the new vCenter server at the Wired Brain Coffee Company. Here's the 3 different data stores configured in that virtual center server. If we expand this out, you can see we have data stores, ESX servers, and folders. Let's expand out the data stores. Let's expand out the ESX servers. Oh, but wait, what happens? We get a prompt here when I go to expand out the ESX server, and it tells us that they recommend you provide Service Console credentials for the ESX host. This would allow leveraging the Service Console agent for increased performance. And I should tell you that this increased performance only applies if you're using the network mode to copy virtual machines to and from an ESX server directly, again, using the network mode of transfer to back up your virtual machines. Now, in our case, we're using the virtual appliance mode, and that's one of the 2 modes that I recommended in the installation video. I recommended virtual appliance, where the Veeam Backup virtual machine runs as a virtual appliance in your virtual infrastructure, and thus that gives it direct access to the data stores in that virtual infrastructure. Or I recommended you use SAN with failover, which would be a physical Windows server running Veeam Backup with direct SAN connectivity. Now, neither one of those methods apply to providing Service Console credentials for the ESX host. But for best practices, and just in case we decide to copy a virtual machine using the network mode directly to an ESX server, I'm going to go ahead and set the credentials here, and I'll check that checkbox, Use Service Console Connection for this server. Again, only if it's needed, only if we choose to copy a virtual machine using the direct network method, which wouldn't be the normal method for backups since we're using the virtual appliance method. And by the way, what this is doing is it's using SSH or SCP to connect to the ESX host directly. And by default, the root user cannot log in using SSH on the console of the server. So if I type in root right here, by default, this just isn't going to work because root isn't going to be allowed to connect to that server via SSH. What I need to do is to create a backup account on that server called ddavis or whatever username applies to you. Put in your password there, And then what you want to do is to elevate this account to root. We can add it to the sudo files automatically, and then enter the root password right here. So that way, Veeam Backup will connect to this server using my account, my non-root account, and then elevate it to root using sudo. And of course, all this assumes that I created that ddavis account or that non-root account previously before I did this. So let's say OK here. And there we go. It looks like those credentials worked. We were able to connect to that ESX host. And I can tell you just by the file structure that expanded out here that this is an ESX server, not an ESXi server. And that's because there's all these files and folders inside the data store because this server obviously has a service console. So let's collapse this and let's go ahead and click on ESX3 and we can expand this out. And here we can see there's just one data store and just 3 folders underneath that data store. And I can very quickly tell you that this is an ESXi server simply because of how the folders are listed underneath the host. Alright, so we have one ESX server, one ESXi server, and then we have our data stores up here. So since we're using the virtual appliance mode, this virtual appliance has direct access to these data stores using the VMware vStorage API. In other words, it doesn't have to connect to that ESX server directly to pull down those backup files. It can connect to the data store directly and bring those files across, or those virtual machines across, back to the Veeam Backup server. Now, alternatively, if this was running in the SAN with failover mode or the SAN direct mode, Veeam Backup would be installed on the physical server that had direct SAN connectivity, and again, it wouldn't be connecting directly to the ESX servers, it would be connecting directly to the SAN and backing up those virtual machines. So at this point, we've added the server that we needed to add, and it was a vCenter server because we're using vCenter to manage the virtual infrastructure. But if we didn't have vCenter, we could have added each of those ESX servers directly. Now, if we go back up to the Veeam Backup and Fast SCP object here in the tree, the second choice here is to create a job. Now, before we create our backup job, there's a couple more things I want to show you. The first one is that you should consider creating email notifications. This way you'll get an email every time a backup job fails, or optionally if a backup job succeeded. To create email notifications, you go up to Tools, and then down to Options. And the first tab here in the Options section is Email Notification. So you would just check here to enable email notification. You would enter the name of your SMTP server. And there's some advanced options in here if your SMTP server requires authentication. You would enter a from address. Let's say that this is from Veeam Backup server at wiredbraincoffee.com. And then I'm going to send it to my email address. And now you can modify the subject down here. By default, the subject would be virtual machine backup job, and then the job name completed, and then the job result. And you would get a notify by default on warning or on failure, but I like to enable it for success as well. And then what we can do here is to send a test message. I'll click on that. And there it says the test message has been sent successfully to, and there's my email address. I'll say OK there. And then I do have my email client open, so let's go down to my email client down here. And there we go. We just got an alert. We got a Veeam Backup test message. It says this is a test message sent by Veeam Backup. So we know that the email alerting is working. If we minimize this, back here, let's just say OK. And there we go. We just configured email notification inside Veeam Backup. Now, the second thing I want to show you before we create our backup job is how to administer users and roles inside Veeam Backup and Fast SCP. To do this, you go up to Tools here, and then down to Users and Roles. I'll click on that, and then what this shows us is the security window for Veeam Backup. And by default here, you can see that the local Windows Administrator group on the Veeam Backup server has Veeam Backup Administrator privileges, or that role, inside Veeam Backup, and the local administrators group also has the Veeam Backup viewer role in Veeam Backup. And there's actually 3 roles here. There's Veeam Backup Administrator, Viewer, and if we click Add, you can see here there's actually Veeam Backup Operator as well. Now, these roles are used more extensively if you're using Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager. That's the umbrella management system for multiple Veeam Backup servers. But even if you only have one Veeam Backup server, you can still use roles here. And I can tell you the basic difference between the three roles is that, of course, administrator has privileges to do everything. The operator has basic privileges to do things like start and stop jobs. And then the viewer, of course, just has really read-only access or view-only access to the Veeam Backup console. So what I recommend you do is to create an Active Directory group that you use to manage your virtual infrastructure, and then use those same types of groups over here inside Veeam Backup. So if we look at the Veeam Backup Administrator group, if we edit that, you might browse to the Active Directory and maybe add that group called VMware Admins, and that Active Directory VMware Admins group would contain all your VMware Virtual Infrastructure Administrators as well as your Veeam Backup Administrators. So you would add that group, and that way they could administer both critical pieces of your virtual infrastructure. So that's how it works. It's real simple. If I wanted to add a user, I could browse here to the Active Directory. I could select the location. I could enter the Active Directory username and password here. And then the location would be, let's say, the user's location. And then let me type in David there, check names, and there I am, David at wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll say OK there. And then I could add myself as a Veeam Backup operator and say OK. And there we go. We just added an Active Directory user. So if you replace this administrators group over here or added to the administrators group with your VMware administrators group from the Active Directory, it would look something like this. So that's how security and users and roles work inside Veeam Backup. Let's say OK there. And now we can move on to creating a job inside Veeam Backup. I'm just going to click Create Job right here. This brings up the new Backup Job Wizard. Now the other way to do this, if we cancel this out, go up here to the Backup button. That Backup button is on every screen inside Veeam Backup. If we click there, this brings up the new Backup Job Wizard, and it asks for a name of the backup job. Of course, you can call your backup job whatever you want. Let's just take the default of backup job number 1. I'll say next here. And now it's asking us for the backup mode. And if you remember in the installation video, we talked about the different transport modes that we would use to transport the data from our virtual infrastructure to our Veeam Backup server. And the recommended mode was the VMware Storage API. And if you use a drop down here, you can see here's some of the different choices that I talked about. Of course, there's SAN with failover, SAN only, network, and virtual appliance. In our case, this is a virtual appliance that we're running on here. So it says with a virtual appliance, the virtual machine data is retrieved from shared storage through the ESX I/O stack. This mode can only be used if Veeam Backup is installed in a virtual machine. And in our case, it is installed as a virtual machine in our virtual infrastructure. Let me show you. So here's our virtual infrastructure, and here's the Veeam Backup virtual machine inside the Windows resource pool on ESX server number 1. And that's actually what I'm connected to using remote desktop. So we are using the virtual appliance mode. Now, if you had a physical server running Veeam Backup, of course, you would select the SAN with failover method here. And that physical server would have to have direct SAN connectivity, either iSCSI or fiber channel, direct SAN connectivity to the virtual infrastructure. Now, if you were using VMware Consolidated Backup, there's your VCB option right there, which is grayed out because Veeam Backup isn't installed on a VCB proxy server. And then the third backup mode down here is network backup. With network backup, the virtual machine data is retrieved over the LAN using proprietary Veeam methods. And that's where those service console credentials come into place. If those are enabled, Veeam Backup connects to the service console of the ESX server, quickly installs a tiny backup client, opens up holes in the firewall, makes entries in the sudo file, backs up the data, and then reverses all that and uninstalls the client. So that's how the network backup works. But of course, it's going to be a slower method because it's going to have to transfer all that virtual machine data across the network or across the LAN. So that's why we're going to use the VMware vStorage API up here with the virtual appliance mode. I'll say next here. And now we're being asked which virtual machines we want to back up. So what we do here is we click Add. And then here we need to select the objects of the virtual infrastructure that we want backed up. Now, the easiest thing to do might be just to select the entire vCenter server and say Add, And then every virtual machine underneath that vCenter server will be backed up even if new virtual machines are added. So that's one quick way to back up everything in the virtual infrastructure. And then what you can do is you can go in here and you can exclude certain virtual machines. And I highly recommend if you're running vCenter or you're running Veeam Backup as a virtual machine, you need to exclude those virtual machines. Because obviously with Veeam Backup, you don't want it to try to back up itself. And with vCenter, Veeam Backup is using vCenter to know what's in the virtual infrastructure. So you don't want the vCenter server paused while backups are being performed. So I would recommend a separate job for the vCenter server, perhaps with some start and stop scripts. But that's a whole different topic. So for now, what we want to do is to exclude, and we can expand out this virtual infrastructure. We can expand out the data center and the ESX servers. And we can exclude certain virtual machines. So let's say that we want to exclude all the Linux servers. And what I can do is I can hold down Control here and I can select multiple servers here by holding down Control. Alright, so I just excluded all the Linux servers. I also want to go back here and I want to exclude the vCenter server. And down here on the bottom, whether I'm adding servers or excluding them, I can use this search function and I can search based on certain types of objects such as folders, clusters, hosts, resource pools, virtual apps, or virtual machines. And I can just enter the name here. So in this case, I'll type in vCenter. And there we go. We found the vCenter server. I'll add that to the exclude list. I also want to exclude Veeam Backup. There we go. I'll select that and add it. So I've excluded all the Linux servers, the vCenter server, and the Veeam Backup server. And the total size of the exclusion down here is 247 gigabytes. So if I say OK there, that brings us back to the virtual machines that are being backed up, and it tells us the total size is 443 gigabytes. Now if we go back to exclusions, notice here you can also tell it specifically which virtual disk you want backed up. For example, maybe you want only the primary disk on every virtual machine backed up. You can do that if you want. So we'll say OK there. And again, we're backing up 443 gigabytes. That's a lot of data. So if we click Next here, now it's asking us where to put this data. Where is the backup storage going to be? Well, of course, you need somewhere that can house at least that 443 gigabytes, but actually much more, because over time, you're going to have a lot more incremental data. This data is going to be held for some period of time, by default 14 days. So you need to make sure that you have enough storage space in the backup destination. Now, if we do the drop down here on the destination, we can send this backup data either to an ESX server, actually the ESX host that the Veeam Backup virtual appliance is running on because we're using virtual appliance mode, or it can go to this computer or to a network share. And a network share is a great way to get this backup data onto a Windows share so that you could then back it up, let's say with a tape backup program to put it on a tape. So what we can do is to browse to a network share. And then on my computer, I actually have a mapped drive. And I've got a folder I created out here called Veeam Backup Repository. So it's going to go to the iomega-nas/backups/Veeam Backup Repository. I'll click check space here. And it tells me that this destination storage has 2.7 terabytes with 1.29 terabytes free. And the source data size is 443 gigabytes. The estimated full backup size, 221, and the estimated required space, 531 gigabytes, so sufficient disk space is available. I'll say OK there. We can also look at advanced options before we move on here. By default, we'll be enabling email notifications for this job. We'll try to quiesce the files using the VMware tools, and we'll run automatic backup integrity checks. There's also an option here to run a post-job activity command when this backup processes. If we look on the compression tab, we'll attempt to enable inline deduplication here to save space on the backup destination. If we look at the vSphere tab, we'll try to use change block tracking, which will allow for faster incremental backups, but keep in mind that virtual hardware version 7 is required on the virtual machines. On the backup tab, here's our retention policy. We'll keep 14 rollback points of these virtual machines. I'll say OK here, and we can say Next. And we're just about done here, just a couple more screens to go. Now it's asking us about VSS integration. So VSS is Microsoft's Volume Shadow Copy Services, which is used in Windows virtual machines to ensure that the backups that are taken are transactionally consistent as opposed to crash consistent. So a crash consistent backup would be a backup of a server where it appeared that you just pulled the power cord and backed up the entire hard drive. So when you booted it back up, it's going to say that there was a crash, the system crashed, and it might have to go through some recovery process, especially if it's a transactional database like SQL or Exchange. On the other hand, a transactionally consistent backup means that the files and the data in that database maintains its integrity. So when you bring it back up after a restore, it shouldn't have to go through any recovery processes to try to put the database back together again. So ideally, you'd like to enable VSS integration on every Windows virtual machine if that Windows virtual machine supports it. But I also recommend that you check to continue backup even if the VSS quiescence fails, because you don't want to stop the backup of all virtual machines just because one virtual machine was unable to use VSS. Now you'll need to provide some credentials here because these credentials will be used with the Windows virtual machine to run VSS and pause that virtual machine while the backup's taken. And it's only a momentary pause. It's not a real long pause. It doesn't happen throughout the whole backup of that virtual machine. It's just a short pause. So let's put in some credentials here. We'll put in the domain administrator credentials. And if we go into the advanced options here, if you're backing up individual virtual machines, you can go in and you can set the username and password for individual virtual machines. I'll say OK. We'll say next. And now it's asking us about the job schedule. It wants to know if we want to run this job automatically. And the answer is absolutely you do. You want to have a regularly run automatic backup job to back up your virtual infrastructure. Now, perhaps if this was a one-time manual job, then maybe you don't want to check that box right now. But for the most part, you're going to have these automatically scheduled jobs out here to take care of the backups of your virtual infrastructure. So you want to set a time and date for these backups to run. I'll say every day at 10 p.m. And then we can click Create. And let's go ahead and run this job when the job finishes. I'll click Finish here. And this takes us to the job queue where you can see that our backup job number 1 here has started. You see the little green triangle right here, the little play button, and the status is 0% complete at 0 kilobits per second. If we double click the job, this brings up the backup job statistics. We can see we've got 9 virtual machines to process here, and currently we're processing object number 1, which is a virtual machine called VDR or VMware Data Recovery. The backup status is in progress for that virtual machine. The total virtual machine size is 105 gigabytes, and we've got a processing rate so far of 2 megabits per second here. It says the backup time remaining is 5 hours, but this is going to be a real long backup, remember, because this is the very first backup we've done of the virtual infrastructure. So it's going to do a full backup the first time, and then after that, thanks to change block tracking, it can do very quick incrementals. Then merge the full backup with the incrementals to create what Veeam calls a synthetic backup, which is one backup image that can be very easily restored, and it's a combination of the full backup and all the changes that have happened since that original full backup. So this backup job is going to take a while to complete. What I'm going to do is to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as this backup job is done. Okay, we're back and the backup job has completed. It says the last result here is an error. If we double click on the job, we can see the status of each virtual machine that we requested to be backed up in this backup job. So we have success all down here across these virtual machines, and then we get here and the last 4 virtual machines say that they failed. Well, train signal training is real-world training, and in the real world, backup jobs sometimes fail. And as administrators, what we need to do is to figure out why these backup jobs failed so that we can do something differently, correct the problem, and then back them up successfully. Now, if we go over to my email, you can see here in my email box, I've got an email from Veeam that says Veeam backup job completed, but it failed. If we double-click this, we can take a look at this report. We can see total virtual machines that we requested to be backed up were 9, and there were 4 failed virtual machines. If we scroll down, we can see each of the virtual machines here, success, success. And when we get down to this point, it says error. We've got these errors highlighted here. If we go over to the right, we can see actually the cause of the error. So we need to take a look at this real closely. It says it tried to back up file, and there's the data store name of the virtual machine, and then the actual VMDK file right there. And it says that backup disk failed, and there was a client error. And the client error was that the specified transports are not available. So the available transport was NBD, and NBD stands for Network Block Device, which is a network-based transport mode. And if you'll recall, we didn't use the network transport mode, we used the virtual appliance mode. And virtual appliance mode uses SCSI hot add to back up virtual machines. So how this works is first, Veeam Backup creates a snapshot of the virtual machine it wants to back up. And then the base disks are then static due to that open snapshot, and they're mounted to the Veeam console virtual machine so that they can be backed up. Then the disks are removed from the hot add mount, and then that snapshot is removed, and then the backup moves on to the next virtual machine to perform the same functions. So here, back to the error log, the available transport was NBD, or Network Block Device, the network transport, but the specified transport was hot add. So we said that we wanted to use hot add with the virtual appliance mode, but the only available mode was network block transport. And that's the reason that the backup of the template here failed. Now, if we look at these other virtual machines, the other 3 virtual machines here, 2 Windows and 1 file transfer Linux-based appliance, they have slightly different error messages. For example, this one says that change block tracking cannot be enabled because virtual hardware version 7 or later is required. So that's a Linux-based virtual appliance that I downloaded from the VMware Virtual Appliance Marketplace, and obviously it doesn't have hardware version 7. So that's something we'll need to check all of our virtual machines for. Now, the other error message here is the same as it was up on the virtual appliance, but I can tell you that we received the same message, but for a different reason. So again, it says the backup failed, the specified transports were not available, available transport was NBD, or Network Block Device, specified transport was hot add. But let's take a look at the VMDK path. The reason that the Network Block Device transport is the only one that's available is the VMDK path is in Data Store 1. Same thing with this virtual machine, Data Store 1. Same thing with this virtual machine, Data Store 1. But if we go up to the template here, it was actually on Storage 1. Now, if we take a look at our vSphere virtual client, notice those last 3 virtual machines that I showed you that failed are on ESX3 right here. There's the 3 virtual machines. And ESX3, if we go to it, the local storage on ESX3 is Data Store 1. But that template is actually up here on ESX1. And that's where Storage 1 is. So the template's on ESX1, and it failed because you can't do a hot add of a template. You have to use Network Block Transport to transport the template files directly from the ESX server. So that's the reason the template failed. But the last 3 virtual machines, they failed because we couldn't do a hot add because we're using the virtual appliance mode, and the Veeam Backup Virtual Appliance is up here on ESX1, and those virtual machines are stored on ESX3 on the local storage. That's very important. If these 3 virtual machines were on the SAN, the backup would have succeeded because ESX server number 1 has access to the SAN. So, in other words, if you put your virtual machines on shared storage, and as long as they're not templates, you're going to be able to back up those virtual machines using hot add. But because these virtual machines were on local storage on another ESX host, not running the Veeam Backup Virtual Appliance, hot add was not available. So the resolution is to go back and we'll exclude these virtual machines, we'll exclude the template, we'll rerun the backup, and the backup should succeed. Let's keep our fingers crossed, because again, this is the real world, and as you know, virtualization admins like you and I, we have real problems with backups in the real world. So let's go back and give it a try. Alright, so what we're going to do is to say OK here. Let's right-click on this backup job. Let's go into the properties of the backup job. Let's go through here. We'll still use the VMware vStorage API Virtual Appliance mode as our backup mode, but we'll say Next here, and then we'll go into Exclusions, and let's add some exclusions. Let's exclude this template. And then let's exclude all virtual machines on ESX3 right now, because I know all those 3 virtual machines are on local storage. All right, so I excluded the entire ESX3 server. We can say OK here. We've recalculated our backup size. Now let's go through here. We'll just say next, next on everything. And we'll go ahead and rerun the job when we're finished and say finish there. And the backup job is restarting. And this time, the backup job should take much less time because, first off, we're not going to have any failed backups, but then also we've done full backups of all those other virtual machines that we successfully backed up. We did that initial full backup, which takes quite a bit of time, and then after that, those incrementals are going to run super fast thanks to the vStorage API and thanks to change block tracking. So the incrementals should run real fast. I'm still going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as this backup's done. Okay, our second backup job has completed, and it says here, if you notice, under last result, it says success. So if I double click on that, we can see we have a success here on all the virtual machines, and the backup time was much less than the original backup because this was an incremental backup. In fact, if we browse out to the file share where these backups are stored, here we can see the original backup with this VBK file, and it's 23 gigs, and then the incremental backup is this VBR file, and it's only 75 megabytes. So there were only 75 megabytes of changes to the original backups, and then these files can be merged on the fly when you do a recovery to create that synthetic backup, or that one image of the virtual machine that's going to be restored, both a combination of the full and then all the changes that have happened since that full. At this point, we've done a full backup and an incremental of some set of virtual machines in our virtual infrastructure. We did have to exclude some virtual machines that were over on ESX server number 3 in our case, because these virtual machines were stored on the local data store of that ESX server. So how can I back up these files? How can I back up these virtual machines even though the Veeam Backup console, or the virtual appliance, is running on ESX server number 1, and these virtual machines are on the local data store of ESX server number 3. Well, of course, if you move these virtual machines, you could use svmotion, and you could move these virtual machines onto the shared storage, and you wouldn't have this problem anymore. But let's say that you want to leave them there. Still, how can you back them up with Veeam Backup? Well, how to do this is, let's go and create a new backup job, and let's call this local backup of VMs on ESX3. I'll say next here. And we talked about the different backup modes. Well, we can still use the VMware vStorage API to back up these virtual machines that are on local data stores on another ESX host. But instead of staying with failover or virtual appliance, we need to choose the network mode. With the network mode, virtual machine data is retrieved still using the VMware vStorage API, but it's done through the ESX host directly on the LAN using NBD, or the Network Block Device Protocol. And while there is the network backup option down here, the VMware vStorage API network mode option is going to be much more efficient than this network backup option at the bottom, which is going to install a proprietary Service Console agent and transfer data that way. So we'll use VMware vStorage API with the network mode. I'll say next here. And now let's select the individual virtual machines. Let's add these virtual machines. I'll hold down the Control key and select these individually. I'll say Add here. We've added the virtual machines. I'll say Next. We'll put them in the same backup repository, but they'll have a new file name this time. Let's quickly check out the advanced settings. We do want email notification. We want to try to quiesce the files using VMware tools. We want integrity checks. We want to use inline deduplication. And we do want to use vSphere's change block tracking feature, which we can use because we're using the vStorage API. I'll say OK there. We can say Next. Here we can attempt to use VSS if we want transactionally consistent virtual machine backups. In this case, for these virtual machines, I really don't care about that, so I'll just say Next here. We'll go ahead and run this job automatically, but we're going to stagger the job. Let's go ahead and run it every day at 11:55 p.m. I'll say Create. We'll go ahead and run the job when we finish and say finish. All right, here you can see the backup job is starting, but I can tell you that this time I'm not going to wait for this backup job to complete. All right, so at this point we created a backup job and we backed up our virtual machines using the virtual appliance mode. Not only did we do a full backup, but we also did an incremental backup after that. And we learned from that process, we learned that virtual machines need to be on shared storage or they need to be on the local disk where the Veeam virtual appliance is running if you're using the virtual appliance mode. Then we created another backup using the vStorage API still, but this time using the network block device or the network mode to back up other virtual machines that were local on another ESX host. I also showed you how to exclude virtual machines such as templates that we didn't want to back up at this time. We also excluded things like VMware vCenter and the Veeam Backup virtual appliance itself because you don't want to back those things up. I'll have a special video on how to back up vCenter because you want to take that into special consideration. With that, we've completed what we came to accomplish here in Veeam Backup in this lesson, and we can go back to our slides. Now back here on our slides, there's one more topic I want to cover before we conclude this video, and that is the 10 things that you must know about backup jobs in Veeam Backup. The first one is that you should back up similar virtual machines in the same job for deduplication space savings. That means if you have similar virtual machines, like say you have a bunch of Linux servers or Windows servers, you'd want to put all the Linux servers together and all the Windows servers together in different backup jobs. They'll go to their own respective destinations, and when that backup happens, the data that's being backed up will be deduplicated. In other words, if there's redundant data in there, that redundant data will be taken out to save you space in your backup destination, and then eventually save you space on the data that you need to take off site on a backup tape. Number 2 points out that we shouldn't back up virtual machines using physical RDMs. That's just a plain no, don't do that one. And in number 3, you need to know that you can only back up a virtual machine using an independent disk if that virtual machine is powered off, or you can exclude an independent disk from the backup when you create the backup job. Also, if you choose to use compression, that'll decrease your backup files, but it may lengthen the duration of the backup time. In number 5, you should avoid parallel backup jobs sharing the same source or target. Really what you're trying to do there is to decrease backup contention or file contention that might slow down your backup job. Now number 6 points out that if your backup window is not large enough to back up all virtual machines, you should install multiple Veeam backup servers and spread those jobs across multiple servers. Then you could manage those multiple servers using Veeam Enterprise Manager. Now, you cannot use change block tracking or CBT if snapshots are present on a virtual machine. So, know your environment, know what snapshots are out there, and create snapshots sparingly. Now, in number 8, it points out you should use a 1 gigabit E1000 virtual NIC driver on your virtual machines, not the VMX Net3 for best performance. Number 9 points out you should make sure that the Veeam Backup appliance, assuming you're using virtual appliance mode, make sure that virtual appliance is stored on the VMFS data store that has the largest block size. You don't want to try to back up VMFS data stores that have larger block sizes than the VMFS that your virtual appliance is running on. And then finally in number 10, don't try to back up vCenter with VSS enabled. I've got a separate video on that shows you how to back up vCenter using VSS but through a different method. And then finally, my bonus tip is make sure that you don't try to back up the Veeam Backup virtual appliance using Veeam Backup. That's a surefire way to mess things up. Trust me, I've tried it. So what did we learn in this lesson? Well, we started off by talking about how to connect your Veeam Backup console to your vSphere virtual infrastructure. We connected our Veeam Backup console to our vCenter server so that it could learn about the virtual machines of the ESX hosts and the data stores that were out there in the virtual infrastructure. I showed you how to configure email notifications so that you can get an email every time there's a backup success or failure. From there, I helped you to understand user roles inside Veeam Backup so that you can delegate administration out to specific Windows users and groups. After that, we created a new backup job using the vStorage API with virtual appliance mode, and we attempted to back up our entire virtual infrastructure except for the vCenter server and the Veeam Backup server. We reviewed the results of that backup job, and just like in the real world, the first backup you do is bound to have some sort of issue, and from there we had to readjust the backup job and create a separate backup job using a different transport, specifically the network block device or the NBD transport, because those virtual machines were stored on the local storage of another ESX server and we were using virtual appliance mode. So we learned a lot about how the different backup transport modes work by going through this process. And then we finish the video up with 10 things you must know about backup jobs when using Veeam Backup. Thanks for watching this video covering configuring and backing up virtual machines with Veeam Backup.